Their code had been cracked. Our trap was ready. That morning, June 4th, 1942, I found myself standing on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, the air buzzing with energy and anticipation. Around me, our dauntless dive bombers were warming up for launch, their engines growling like angry lions about to be unleashed. The Pacific stretched endlessly ahead, a shimmering expanse of gold beneath the rising sun. It looked calm, almost too calm, considering that before the day was over, this same stretch of ocean would become the graveyard of Japan's proudest carriers. Somewhere out there, about 200 miles northwest of Midway Island, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were steaming confidently toward their target. Those were the same ships that had torn into Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. Their decks were crowded with aircraft, their crews eager and certain they were headed for another easy victory. What they didn't know was that we'd been listening in for weeks, quietly reading their coded messages. We knew exactly where they were going to be, and we were ready to spring what would become one of the greatest ambushes in naval history. My name's Norman Jack Dusty Kleiss. I was a lieutenant junior grade, a dive bomber pilot with Scouting Squadron 6 aboard the Enterprise. I grew up in Coffeyville, Kansas, born in 1916. After graduating from the Naval Academy in 1938, I earned my wings in April of 1941 and started flying combat missions soon after during the Marshall Islands raids. By the summer of '42, I figured I had a decent grasp of carrier warfare, but the truth is, nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what we were about to see that day. Within minutes, the entire balance of the Pacific War was going to shift, and Japan's mighty carrier force would be wiped from the sea. That morning, around 400 hours, the ready room aboard the Enterprise was thick with cigarette smoke and quiet tension. Every man there knew something big was coming. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, Jr., our air group commander, stood at the front with his pointer in hand. McCluskey was a 1926 Naval Academy graduate who'd only taken over the air group a couple of months earlier, but he carried himself like a man born for command. "Gentlemen," he began, his tone steady and clear, "the Japanese carrier force has been spotted about 200 miles northwest of Midway." He pointed at a large map spread across the board. 4 carriers, Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, supported by 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers. He paused for a moment to let that sink in. These weren't just any carriers. They were the backbone of Japan's Kido Butai, the most powerful mobile strike force in the world at that time. Akagi and Kaga were the old Pearl Harbor veterans, massive ships, capable of launching more than 60 planes each. Soryu and Hiryu were newer, faster, and just as dangerous. Together, those 4 carriers carried 248 aircraft and some of the most skilled naval aviators alive. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team over at Station Hypo have been working day and night, cracking the Japanese naval code, JN-25. McCluskey continued. "We know their entire battle plan. They'll hit Midway at dawn, wait for our carriers to come charging in, and then they'll try to ambush us. What they don't realize," he said with a faint smile, "is that we're already waiting for them." Our intelligence officer stepped up next, laying out Admiral Yamamoto's grand plan to capture Midway and crush our carrier fleet once and for all. It was an intricate operation, maybe too intricate for its own good. There were invasion forces coming up from the southwest, a diversionary attack in the Aleutians, and the main carrier strike force advancing from the northwest. Yamamoto himself commanded the whole thing from his flagship, the mighty battleship Yamato, sitting 300 miles behind the front lines. "The Japanese will launch their strike on Midway around 0430, the officer said. "Most of their fighters will be busy over the island. Their carriers will be recovering and rearming aircraft. That's when they'll be most vulnerable. And that's when we'll strike." Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, who led Scouting Squadron 6, scribbled notes carefully in his pad. Gallagher was a Pearl Harbor veteran, and one of the most precise men I'd ever known. Sitting beside him was Lieutenant Richard Best from Bombing Squadron 6, his eyes scanning the weather report. Wind out of the southeast at 5 knots, scattered clouds at 1,500 feet, ideal diving weather. I glanced around the room at my squadron mates. Some had seen combat before, others were about to for the first time. Everyone understood exactly what was at stake. The Japanese had better planes. Their Zeros could outmaneuver anything we had. Their pilots were more seasoned too. And on top of that, we'd be flying at the edge of our range, 175 miles out, 175 miles back, with barely enough fuel to make it home if things went sideways. We were flying out and back with hardly any fuel to spare. "Torpedo 8 from the Hornet goes in first," McCluskey said. "Dive bombers follow. Launch at 0700. By 6 o'clock, the Enterprise flight deck had become organized chaos. Men in colored jerseys moved like clockwork, red shirts hoisting bombs into racks, purple shirts pumping fuel, brown shirts checking engines and linkages. I walked up to my bird, SBD Bureau number 639. My rear gunner, John Snowden, was already running his fingers over the twin 30 caliber machine guns, making sure everything was locked and ready. Snowden was from Illinois, a quiet sort of fellow with eyes like a hawk. He'd once saved my skin by spotting incoming Zeros before they could get on our tails. "Morning, Snowden," I said as I clambered in. "Morning, Mr. Kleiss. Gonna be a hot one," he answered, calm as ever. I went through the pre-flight checklist: control surfaces, bomb rack, fuel load. We had 230 gallons in the main tank and 2 58-gallon wing tanks, with careful throttle work that gave us roughly 4.5 hours aloft. The SBD Dauntless wasn't built for speed, about a 255 MF top end, but she was rock steady in a dive and could take a beating most planes couldn't. I strapped in surrounded by familiar gauges: altimeter, airspeed, fuel, oil pressure, engine temp. At 0645, the tannoy crackled. "Pilots, start engines." I hit the starter and the right R-1820 Cyclone thundered to life. First off the deck were the Wildcats, 20 F-4Fs to set up combat air patrol. Then came the torpedo planes, 14 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 6 under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. I watched them lumber down the deck with their heavy Mark 13 torpedoes hanging beneath. They barely cleared the ship's edge and looked painfully exposed. Finally, it was our turn. Scouting 6 under Gallagher, 18 planes, and Bombing 6 under Best with 15. I was number 2 in the 3rd Division, and McCluskey led the whole show. Launch is always the hairy part. Enterprise turned into the wind and steamed up to 30 knots. The flight deck officer spun his flag, then dropped it to full power. I released the brakes, shoved the throttle forward, and the island flashed past. At 65 knots, I eased back. The plane hesitated, heavy with fuel and bombs. Then the wings grabbed, and we climbed away. "Good takeoff, Mr. Kleiss," Snowden said over the intercom. "Thanks. Keep your eyes peeled," I replied. It took about an hour for the strike force to form up. By 8:06, we had 33 dive bombers from the Enterprise climbing to 19,000 feet. Our planned rendezvous with Hornet's group never materialized. McCluskey decided we'd press on alone rather than burn fuel waiting. So we held radio silence and pressed northwest at 19,000 feet. I kept checking instruments and my bomb sight over and over. At that altitude, you get maybe 10 seconds to line up and release. No do-overs. By 0920, we hit the intercept point. Nothing but empty ocean. My fuel gauge showed more than half gone. A quick back of the envelope put us at maybe 30 minutes to find the fleet before we had to turn back or think about ditching. Radio silence felt like a weight in the cockpit. Every man was running the same numbers in his head. Then, at 0955, McCluskey waggled his wings. I looked down and picked up a white wake, a lone destroyer ripping northeast. McCluskey banked to follow, betting she was headed for the main fleet. For 20 agonizing minutes, we trailed that wake, watching our fuel tick toward empty. At 10:20 it happened. The Japanese fleet appeared below us, tiny at first and then filling the world. 4 carriers in 2 groups surrounded by escorts, planes parked on deck, white wakes marking their maneuvers. Remarkably, there were no Zeros up at our altitude. They were down low, finishing off the torpedo squadrons. McCluskey's voice cut through. "This is McCluskey. Scouting 6, take the left carrier. Bombing 6, the right." But in the confusion, both squadrons started diving on Kaga. I shoved the stick forward and pointed my nose down. The G's hit like a freight train, pinning me to the seat. The altimeter rushed. 18,000, 15,000, 12,000 feet. The carrier filled my bomb sight, and I could make out aircraft on her deck and men running like ants. Anti-aircraft guns below started to swivel, and black bursts of flak popped all around us like angry thunderclouds. I held steady, eyes locked on the target. At 10,000 feet, I could see individual planes parked on Kaga's deck, some being refueled, others rearmed. Fuel hoses snaked across the deck, bombs rested on small carts. It was perfect timing. The enemy was caught wide open at their most vulnerable moment. Gallagher dropped first. His bomb slammed in near Kaga's island, erupting in a fiery blast that sent debris and bodies into the air. At 2,500 feet, I thumbed the release and yanked back hard on the stick. The G-force hit like a sledgehammer. 9 Gs pressing me deep into the seat, my vision closing down to a narrow tunnel. The Dauntless screamed in protest, wings flexing violently, but she leveled out just above the waves and tore away at full throttle. "Direct hit!" Snowden yelled over the intercom. "Forward elevator!" I banked left and saw it. My bomb had landed square on target. Kaga's forward deck was a sheet of fire. Gallagher's hit had blown the aft section wide open, and others were finding their marks too. Within seconds, 4 direct hits turned Kaga into a burning inferno from stem to stern. At the same time, Dick Best pulled out early and realized the confusion. Both our squadrons had gone for the same target. Without hesitation, he and 2 of his wingmen broke off and headed straight for Akagi. Best's 1,000-pounder went right through her flight deck and into the hangar, detonating among fully armed planes being refueled. Akagi vanished into a roaring fireball. Then, almost on cue, at exactly 10:22, dive bombers from the Yorktown arrived overhead and struck Soryu. 3 1,000-pound bombs hit her in the span of half a minute. The explosions were blinding. A column of fire shot skyward 1,000 feet high. In just minutes, 3 of Japan's mighty carriers were mortally wounded. As I pulled away, the scene below looked like something out of hell. Kaga was a floating volcano, secondary explosions rippling through her hull, fire licking at the sky. Her forward elevator, several tons of steel, blew completely free, spinning through the air, before crashing into the sea hundreds of yards away. Akagi burned from bow to stern, her flight deck warped and buckling under the heat. I could see tiny figures, men, leaping overboard into the slick, burning water below. Soryu was listing hard, explosions tearing through her hull. Within minutes, she rolled over completely, her red underside glistening briefly in the sunlight before she slipped under. It had taken barely 20 minutes to turn one of Japan's strongest carriers into a watery tomb. More than 700 of her crew went down with her. But Hiryu, the 4th carrier, was still out there. We hadn't seen her. She was operating about 10 miles to the north, hidden behind a rain squall, and even as we were pulling out, she was already launching her counterstrikes against our fleet. "Zeros, 3 o'clock high." Snowden's voice cut in. His twin 30s opened up, the guns rattling like jackhammers as 2 enemy fighters dropped on us from above. I shoved the stick forward, pushing the Dauntless into a steep dive to use our superior speed. Tracers sliced through the air around us, bright threads whipping past the canopy. Then Snowden's guns went silent. "Snowden, you okay?" I shouted. "Hit, but okay," he groaned. Got one of 'em a zero trailed smoke and spiraled into the ocean, vanishing in a flash of spray. One down. But more were coming. I stayed low, weaving side to side, trying to make myself a harder target. My fuel gauge was bouncing off empty, the needle dancing at the bottom like it knew what was coming. The flight back was a nightmare. The gauge sat flat, but I knew there were usually a few stubborn gallons sloshing in the lines. Fuel you couldn't normally use unless you nursed it just right. I leaned the mixture until the engine started to cough and sputter, risking fouled plugs just to squeeze out a few extra minutes of flight time. Around me, Dauntlesses limped along, some trailing smoke, others dropping altitude, engines cutting out one by one. The radio came alive with desperate voices. Engine failure, going in. Ditching mark position. Emergency fuel, requesting landing priority. Each transmission carried that quiet edge of resignation, the sound of men who knew they were out of options. 2 planes ahead of me nosed down toward the sea. I watched one hit hard but stay intact. The pilot and gunner scrambled out onto the wing before it sank. My own engine sputtered again, coughing like an old man on his last breath. I switched over to the reserve tank, maybe a few gallons left, minutes at best. Then, through the haze and sunlight, the Enterprise appeared on the horizon. I can't tell you how good that sight felt. The most beautiful ship I'd ever seen. Enterprise, this is Kleiss, low fuel. Request immediate landing, I called in. You're number 3, came the reply. I watched the 2 planes ahead of me land, each one taking precious seconds. My engine was missing badly, coughing, sputtering. As I turned into the landing pattern, it finally gave out completely. Dead stick, no power, 1 shot to make it. I had just enough altitude and speed, dropped the gear, extended the flaps, aimed dead center for the number 3 wire. The landing signal officer waved frantically. Cut! You're high! I shoved the nose down, trading altitude for speed, the prop windmilling uselessly. The deck rushed up fast. We hit. Hard. The Dauntless bounced once. Then the tail hook caught the 3rd wire and slammed us to a stop so suddenly my harness cut into my shoulders. Before the propeller even stopped spinning, the deck crew was sprinting toward us. Get us out! I yelled. They pulled Snowden from the rear seat first. He was bleeding, hit in the shoulder and leg, but he was conscious and talking. Tough as they came, he'd make it. My plane, SBD 639, looked like she'd flown through a sawmill. More than 40 holes peppered through the fuselage and wings. How she held together, I'll never understand. The ready room after that was quiet. Too quiet. The smell of sweat, smoke, and oil hung in the air. Despite the victory, there was no celebration. Of the 14 torpedo bombers from our Torpedo 6, only 4 made it back. 10 crews were gone. The news from Hornet was even worse. Torpedo 8, completely wiped out. 15 aircraft lost, 29 of 30 men dead. Only one, Ensign George Gay, survived. He'd floated in the sea, watching the rest of us dive on the carriers he helped expose. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had led them straight in. His last transmission came over the radio before the attack. We will go in. We won't turn back. Good luck. Not one of them did. No torpedoes hit their mark that morning, but their sacrifice had dragged every Japanese fighter down to sea level, clearing the skies for our bombers. Without them, we might never have made it through. McCluskey came in later, his shoulder wrapped in a bloody bandage from a 20mm shell that had torn through his cockpit. He was pale but grinning. We got 3, he said simply. Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, all finished. Hiryu's still out there. She's hit Yorktown hard. Intelligence reports filtered in through the afternoon. Yorktown had taken 3 bomb hits around noon and 2 torpedoes at 14:30. She was badly listing, her crew forced to abandon ship. But she'd bought us time. Enough time to find Hiryu. Japanese losses were staggering. Roughly 2,500 men already gone. Each carrier carried around 1,200 to 1,500 crew and airmen. Very few were rescued. Each number was a person, a son, a husband, a father, dying out there in fire and salt water, thousands of miles from home, all for the ambitions of an empire. That afternoon, we went back up again. 24 Dauntlesses launched from Enterprise and Yorktown's survivors. At 1700 hours, we found Hiryu. 4 bombs hit home. Would you like me to continue the next section, the attack on Hiryu in the final hours of the battle, in the same tone and style? She burned all through the night before finally going under. With Hiryu's scuttling, the Kido Butai, the once invincible heart of Japan's naval air power, was gone. In the days that followed, as we pursued the retreating Japanese fleet, we caught and sank the cruiser Mikuma. That's when the true weight of what had happened really sank in. Japan hadn't just lost 4 ships. They'd lost 4 fleet carriers, vessels that had taken years to design, construct, and commission. Those ships couldn't be replaced quickly, not with Japan's limited industrial capacity. But even more devastating was the loss of over 3,000 trained sailors and airmen, including more than 100 veteran pilots who'd spent years mastering the art of carrier warfare. Men whose instincts and experience couldn't be replicated overnight. That knowledge died with them. The Imperial Japanese Navy never fully recovered. They'd started the war with 6 powerful fleet carriers. Now they were down to 2. They would eventually build new ones, but they never again had the skilled pilots to make those ships truly dangerous. The institutional expertise that had once made their carrier divisions the deadliest force in the Pacific died with the Kido Butai on June 4, 1942. For us Americans, Midway proved that intelligence, planning, and courage could overcome sheer numbers. Commander Rochefort's codebreakers, our heroes in plain clothes, had given us the enemy's playbook, allowing us to position our carriers perfectly. Without that information, we would have been reacting instead of acting, arriving late, fighting on their terms, and likely losing everything. The battle also laid bare the cracks in Japanese strategy. Yamamoto's plan, while clever, was far too complex. His forces were spread thin across thousands of miles, unable to support each other once things went sideways. Their obsession with radio silence prevented them from adjusting when the plan unraveled. And, perhaps most fatally, they underestimated us, believing the Americans would respond predictably, without imagination. Admiral Nagumo faced a no-win situation that morning. When his scouts reported sighting American ships at 0728, he was already in the middle of rearming his planes for a second strike on Midway. Should he launch immediately, with the wrong weapons loaded, or take time to rearm for an anti-ship attack? His 30-minute hesitation, just half an hour, proved fatal. By the time he made his choice, we were already diving through the clouds. That night, as the Enterprise steamed southwest through the calm Pacific, I found myself standing alone on the deck, staring up at the stars. They were the same stars that had hung over Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, the same silent witnesses to the fiery death of 4 Japanese carriers that very day. With the adrenaline gone, I felt only exhaustion, and a hollow sort of ache that victory couldn't touch. My thoughts kept going back to the torpedo crews who had flown straight into certain death. Waldron's men from Torpedo 8 knew their TBD devastators were obsolete death traps against the Agile Zeros, but they went anyway, holding their course as they were torn apart, fulfilling their duty to the last. Ensign George Gay had watched it all from the water, his friends dying one by one, Waldron's plane exploding mid-air, devastators cartwheeling into the sea in flames. Gay floated for 30 hours in shark-infested waters, hiding beneath a seat cushion as Japanese ships searched the area. He lived, but the guilt stayed with him for the rest of his life. And then there were the Japanese sailors I'd helped kill. When you dive on a carrier, you can see them, tiny figures running across the deck, manning guns, pushing burning aircraft overboard. They weren't faceless enemies. They were young men like us, doing what they believed was right for their country. Some of those Kaga and Akagi pilots had been flying since the China campaign back in 1937. They had families, letters tucked into their flight suits, dreams waiting for them back home. All of it ended in fire that June morning. The sea was littered with bodies afterward. A few were rescued by destroyers, but thousands more died in burning oil, drowned, or were taken by sharks. War isn't clean. It's not simple, and it sure as hell isn't glorious. It's just young men dying far from home. Historians would later call Midway the turning point of the Pacific War, and they were right. In one day, the balance of naval power shifted completely. Japan went from dominance to equality, and as America's shipyards began to roar to life, that balance tipped even further. Real victory didn't come from any one weapon or moment. It came from the combination of things: the pilots, the engineers, the codebreakers, the mechanics, the planners, all the parts working together. Japan lost an entire generation of elite pilots at Midway, and later through the brutal attrition at Guadalcanal. Those men couldn't be replaced. Japan's training program could turn out maybe 100 carrier pilots a year, while ours soon produced thousands. Admiral Nimitz later summed it up best. Midway was won by intelligence officers who broke the codes, by the damage control teams who got Yorktown back into the fight in 72 hours, when everyone said it would take 3 months, and by the pilots who pressed their attacks against impossible odds. Every piece of that puzzle mattered. It wasn't just a military victory. It was a triumph of industry, determination, and sheer will. While we were still fighting at Midway, new Essex-class carriers were already being laid down back home, massive ships that dwarfed anything the Japanese could build. In time, America would complete 24 of them. Japan, struggling to keep up, managed to finish just 6 new carriers, most of them hurried conversions from other hulls, and none of them the equal of ours. Japan had entered the war with 6 first-line fleet carriers and the finest naval aviators in the world. After Midway, they were down to 2, and their best pilots, those with years of experience, were gone. They built new ships, yes, but never again could they train the men needed to fly from their decks effectively. The carefully crafted strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months died at Midway. As for me, I survived the war. I flew 85 combat missions and was credited with hits on 3 enemy ships at Midway, the carriers Kaga and Hiryu, and later the cruiser Mikuma. For that, I received the Navy Cross. I stayed in uniform through the Korean War, retiring as a captain in 1962. I lived to be 100. Passing in 2016, one of the last surviving Midway dive bomber pilots. Clarence McCluskey pulled through his injuries and retired a rear admiral in 1956. He never sought fame for that one fateful decision, the moment he chose to follow a lone Japanese destroyer's wake when all logic said to turn back. That instinct changed history. His son Phil once said, "Dad was a quiet guy, not a big talker." McCluskey passed away in 1976, his pivotal role in the battle largely forgotten. George Gay went on to fly for Trans World Airlines after the war. For decades, he traveled the country, speaking about the bravery and sacrifice of his squadron. He wrote Sole Survivor, a memoir of that terrible morning, and often appeared at Navy events. When he died in 1994, his ashes were scattered over the very waters where his squadron had perished, where he had watched them die 52 years before. Dick Best, the man whose single perfect bomb destroyed Akagi, was forced to retire soon after Midway. During the battle, a faulty oxygen system had exposed him to caustic soda fumes that permanently damaged his lungs. He never flew again, but lived until 2001. He was often called the man who won Midway. The Japanese carriers still rest where they fell, on the dark floor of the Pacific, 17,000 feet below. In 2019, Kaga was found sitting upright, her hull largely intact though her deck was torn open. Akagi was discovered nearby, twisted and blackened from fire. They are war graves now, tombs for the thousands who went down with them. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo survived the battle but never truly recovered from its failure. He was reassigned to shore commands, later tasked with defending Saipan. As American forces overran the island in July 1944, Nagumo took his own life. His chief of staff, Admiral Kusaka, survived the war and wrote extensively afterward, accepting responsibility while defending the impossible decisions Nagumo had faced. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and survived the explosions aboard Akagi, was badly wounded, both ankles shattered. But he lived. After the war, he converted to Christianity and became a missionary, spending his later years promoting reconciliation between Japan and the United States. People often say Japan lost the war at Midway in 5 short minutes. And maybe they're right. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was shot down in April 1943 when American P-38s, guided by decoded Japanese transmissions, intercepted his plane over Bougainville. Before his death, he is said to have told his staff, "I have killed many young men today," knowing Midway had doomed his Navy. In 2000, Midway Atoll was declared a national memorial. The old runway where Marines once fought against impossible odds is now a wildlife sanctuary. Albatrosses nest peacefully where bombs once fell. Looking back, I never saw myself as a hero. None of us did. We were just young men doing what needed to be done. The real heroes were the torpedo crews who flew into certain death without flinching, the codebreakers who worked in silence and secrecy, the mechanics who kept our planes flying, the damage control teams who saved our ships, the corpsmen who pulled bleeding men back from the edge. Midway proved that wars aren't won by the best equipment or the most experienced fighters. They're won by those who adapt, who take risks, who keep going no matter the losses. The Japanese had better pilots, faster planes, and more experience. But we had broken their codes. We had radar. We had engineers who could patch up a ship in days instead of months. And most of all, we had the industrial power to replace every loss tenfold. Above all, we had leaders willing to take calculated risks. Admiral Nimitz gambled our entire carrier force on intelligence that could have been wrong. McCluskey risked running out of fuel to find the enemy. Dick Best risked everything when he broke formation to attack a different carrier. And John Waldron led his men straight into death because that's what the mission demanded. The Battle of Midway lasted only 2 days, but it changed everything. Before that fight, Japan seemed unstoppable. After it, the tide had turned. After Midway, Japan never won another offensive battle. The war dragged on for 3 more terrible years, costing hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. But the outcome, the true turning of the tide, had already been decided in those few fateful minutes on June 4th, when our dive bombers caught Japan's carriers with decks loaded with fueled, armed planes. It's hard not to think about how easily history might have gone the other way. What if McCluskey had turned back at the empty intercept point, thinking we'd missed them? What if the Japanese had launched their attack 30 minutes earlier? What if our torpedoes had actually worked and Torpedo 8 had struck first? Small choices, split-second decisions, chance itself, each one with the power to shape the fate of nations. But history isn't made on what might have been, it's made on what was. And what happened that morning in June 1942 was clear. A handful of outnumbered American pilots, flying slower, less advanced aircraft, caught the most powerful naval force on Earth at its moment of greatest vulnerability and destroyed it. They turned the tide of the Pacific War through a mix of intelligence, courage, sacrifice, and yes, a little luck. Today's generation can hardly imagine a time when democracy itself stood in jeopardy, when the freedom of the world was uncertain. But we could. In June 1942, the fate of that free world rested in the hands of a few hundred young pilots from 3 American carriers in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And somehow, against logic, against the odds, we were enough. That's Midway's lesson. Ordinary men, when pushed into extraordinary circumstances, can rise higher than anyone expects. Democracies can produce warriors every bit as brave as any totalitarian empire ever could, because free men fighting for their homes, their families, and their way of life are the most powerful force on Earth. The numbers tell the story, but never the feeling. 3,057 Japanese dead, 362 Americans. 4 Japanese carriers lost, 1 American. But those statistics don't capture the reality. Each number was a person, a life filled with hopes, dreams, fears, and people who loved them. Each death was a tragedy. So many young men who should have grown old, seen grandchildren, and lived peaceful lives instead, died in fire and seawater. The Pacific rolls on now, calm and indifferent. No markers to show where the great carriers went down, just patches of empty ocean. But we remember. We must remember. As long as free people exist, we must remember Midway and the men who fought there. They saved the world in a matter of minutes. 4 of the Imperial Navy's proudest carriers destroyed between breakfast and noon. The course of the war, the fate of nations, the very future of freedom, all decided by a few dozen dive bomber pilots pressing their attacks through flak and fire against impossible odds. That's the true legacy of Midway. Not just victory, but example. When tyranny rises, free people stand up. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's action in spite of it. Sometimes the fate of the world hangs on the shoulders of just a few brave souls. And when it does, ordinary people can do the most extraordinary things. The dead of Midway, American and Japanese alike, deserve to be remembered not just as soldiers, but as human beings who gave their lives in service to their nations. The American pilots who flew to certain death defending freedom. The Japanese sailors who fought and died trying to save their burning ships. They were all brave men, deserving better than to die so young in the lonely middle of the Pacific. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Because of them, freedom endured, and it flourished. The Pacific, once the greatest battlefield on Earth, is now a sea of peace, crossed by merchants instead of warships. America and Japan, once bitter enemies, are now close allies. The war that once seemed endless has been over for more than 75 years. Soon, there will be no one left who can say, "I was there." No one who can tell you what it was like to see Kaga erupt in flame, to watch Akagi burn from bow to stern, to dive through black walls of flak and hit a target knowing it might be the last thing you ever did. But the story endures. It has to endure, because people who value freedom need to understand what it costs. Freedom isn't free. It's bought and paid for with the blood and courage of men who climbed into obsolete planes and flew straight into hell. Men who faced impossible odds, diving through anti-aircraft fire, pressing home their attacks, giving everything they had so tyranny could be stopped in its tracks. That's what Midway did. It stopped tyranny. It saved freedom. It changed history. In those world-altering minutes on a bright June morning in 1942, when the fate of the world hung in the balance, a few American pilots, ordinary young men from farms, towns, and cities across the country, tipped the scales toward freedom. And because of them, the world is what it is today.